My son was still in the water when the man found him. That's what the neighbor told me later. Jerome's truck had gone through the guardrail on Old Miller Road and down the embankment into the creek below, and Jerome himself had been pinned between the door and the current. For God knows how long before Henry Stokes' German Shepherd started barking and refused to move on. Henry was 68 years old, and he waded in up to his chest in that November water to pull my boy to the bank. I got the call at 7:43 in the evening. I was making cornbread. By the time I reached Jerome, he was on his feet and refusing the ambulance the paramedics had called. He had a gash along his temple, and his left wrist was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. I could see the break from 10 feet away. But his eyes, when they found me, were sharp. Not the eyes of a confused man who had driven into a creek. The eyes of a man who had been waiting to tell me something. "Mama," he said quietly, while the paramedics were still talking at him, "I need you to take me home." That night, I sent a message to my sister. I told her it was time to use what Daddy had taught us before he died. I am Thelma Wills. I am 63 years old, a widow, the daughter of Leonard and Leona Lattimore of Whitfield County, Georgia. My father spent 31 years as a mail carrier, and every one of those years, he walked that route with his head up, regardless of what the county thought about men who looked like him. My mother played piano at Mount Olive Baptist until her fingers wouldn't cooperate anymore, and she taught Sunday schools until 3 weeks before she passed. I spent 28 years working at the county courthouse as a records supervisor and retired with a pension and a reputation for knowing where everything was filed. People in this county knew me as a woman of particular patience and very little tolerance for nonsense. Jerome is 36. He became an architect, the only one for 40 miles who looked like us, and 6 years ago he married Lynette Holt. Lynette is a good woman, gentle, bookish, prone to crying at nature documentaries. She came from money in the way that some families in Georgia come from money, which is to say her grandmother had been the right kind of white in the right generation, and that inheritance had compounded itself into real estate and a name on 3 county buildings. Her mother, Eugenia Holt, was president of the Piedmont Children's Foundation. Her photograph appeared in the Whitfield Gazette every spring beside a ceremonial check and a practiced smile. I had known from the beginning that Eugenia Holt did not want her daughter to marry my son. She never said so directly. She was too practiced for that. But I had spent a lifetime learning to read the language of polite contempt, and Eugenia spoke it fluently. The way she stepped back at introductions before Jerome's hand was fully extended. The way she discussed their family history in rooms where my sons sat. The way she said once, in what she apparently considered a compliment, that Lynette had always been drawn to people who were different from our circle. I was not confused about what she meant by that. Jerome had asked me not to make it into something. Said Lynette's mother was difficult with everyone, that she'd come around, that what mattered was what Lynette thought of him, and Lynette loved my son in a way that was plain to any room they entered together. That part was never in question. So I kept my mouth shut and watched, because my father taught me that some kinds of opposition you dismantle quietly by refusing to go away. I did not expect it to come to this. On the drive home from the creek, Jerome told me everything in pieces, pausing when the pain made it difficult to speak. 2 weeks before, he had been helping Lynette sort through papers for the foundation's annual audit. Lynette sat on the advisory board, largely as a formality, the way Eugenia kept her involved, just enough to call it a family enterprise. Jerome noticed something while organizing a stack of payment authorizations. A firm called Piedmont Consulting Services had received 4 separate wire transfers in the past 18 months totaling just under $900,000. The paperwork on file described the payments as program infrastructure support. Jerome was an architect. He knew what infrastructure support looked like, and it did not look like that. I started pulling at threads, he said. I looked up the registration number. The firm was tied to a post office box in Macon. No website, no physical address, no employees on record. I found 2 more firms like it going back 5 years. Different names, same structure. He had gone to Eugenia directly. He told me he'd done it because he thought there might be an explanation. That maybe someone on her staff was operating without her knowledge. That he wanted to give her the chance to say so. Eugenia had listened to everything. Then she told him he had misunderstood the foundation's accounting structure. Said the payments were part of a legitimate matching grant mechanism too complex to explain to someone outside nonprofit finance. She appreciated his concern. And then she suggested he come look at some land parcels outside town the following Thursday. Said she'd been meaning to discuss a building project, that perhaps the foundation needed a new annex, that Jerome might be exactly the right person for the job. Jerome told me he almost believed her. He went on Thursday. Eugenia met him on Old Miller Road, where there was supposed to be a property with a road frontage question. They walked the perimeter of a vacant lot, and then Eugenia said something Jerome told me he would never forget. Son, she said. She had never called him that, not once in 6 years. Lynette loves you. But this family has a way of protecting itself. You would do well to understand that. Jerome felt something come over him that had nothing to do with the November air. He started walking back to his truck. He heard her SUV start behind him. He assumed she was leaving. He did not see her pull forward and accelerate until he was already through the guardrail. She didn't follow me down, he said. I heard her car stop at the edge. I was in the water. I heard her door open, and then I heard it close, and she left. I drove the rest of the way to my house without a word. My hands were steady on the wheel. That is a thing about grief and rage. When they reach a certain level, they cancel each other out and leave you very, very calm. I set Jerome up on the couch, splinted his wrist, cleaned the cut along his temple, checked his pupils and his ribs. My mother had been a practical nurse before she married, and she had passed on what she knew, and 3 years of cross-training with the county medical examiner's office had filled in the rest. I had enough to manage until we could see someone I trusted. Lynette doesn't know what happened, Jerome said when I had finished with the splint. She thinks I swerved to miss a deer. I hadn't told her what I found because I wanted to be sure. I hadn't told her about the conversation on the road because I didn't know how to. He looked at the ceiling. She's pregnant. 11 weeks. We were going to wait to tell people. I sat down. I had been holding myself together since the phone call with both hands. Now I felt something give way inside me. Not grief exactly, but something older and colder. The image of Eugenia Holt at the edge of that embankment, opening her car door to listen, deciding, closing it again and driving home. And beneath that image, everything I had known for 6 years and held back from saying finally taking its full shape. This woman had decided, long before tonight, that my son was disposable, that what he came from was disposable, that the blood he would give his children was something to be managed, and, if necessary, removed. Your truck, I said. Did Eugenia's people ever have access to it? Jerome looked at me. Her husband's dealership serviced it last spring. Why? We found the tracking device together, Jerome directing me from the couch, while I crouched under the chassis with a flashlight, magnetic, tucked behind the rear wheel well, small and black, and blinking patiently in the dark of the garage, like a calm and waiting eye. I put it in a coffee can on the back porch. Let it keep blinking. Let whoever was watching think we were still sitting still. Then I turned off both our phones and went to the kitchen drawer where I kept my father's old address book. Paper, the kind nobody uses anymore. And found the number for my sister Celestine. Celestine is 58. She served 12 years in the Army and came home knowing things she doesn't often discuss. She runs a small firm in Atlanta that helps people find what other people have tried to hide. She has never been married. She calls me every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock and has not missed a Sunday in 11 years. I drove to the gas station 2 miles down the road and used the payphone outside, the only one left in the county, still operational because the owner is 81 years old and doesn't trust cell phones. I told Celestine in 4 sentences what had happened. There was a pause on her end. "Don't call anyone else," she said. "Don't go to the local police. I'm coming." She arrived before sunrise, through the back door I had left unlocked, with a laptop and a portable internet device she'd brought from Atlanta. She sat at my kitchen table and did not waste any time being horrified. She gathered facts and started working. By noon, she had found 7 shell companies. By 3 in the afternoon, she had traced the financial structure through 2 layers of holding accounts to a trust registered in the Cayman Islands under a name that matched Eugenia Holt's maternal grandmother, a name that would appear on no surface search unless you knew what you were looking for. 9 years, Celestine said. The foundation brings in approximately $4 million annually. Based on what I can access, somewhere between 30 and 50% of that has been redirected over the life of the operation. She closed the laptop. That's a federal case. Then we go to the FBI, Jerome said. Celestine looked at him the way she used to look at me when I was young and said something that showed I hadn't yet learned how the world worked. We could, and an investigation takes time. And in the meantime, Eugenia Holt knows exactly what you know, and she already tried to kill you once. Lynette had been sitting in the corner of the room since Celestine arrived, listening, saying nothing. She was pale in a way that had nothing to do with her complexion. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to your father," Celestine said. Lynette shook her head. "My parents have been separated for 4 years. He lives in Savannah. They barely speak." "I know," Celestine said. "I found that too. I also found that your father's attorney filed a motion 8 months ago for access to the foundation's financial records as part of the separation proceedings. Eugenia blocked it through a procedural objection. A man doesn't fight for financial records unless he suspects there's something in them worth finding." Lynette's father was named Winston Holt. In 6 years, Jerome and Lynette had seen him perhaps 4 or 5 times. Jerome described him as polite, quiet, not unkind. A civil engineer who had retired early and by all appearances stepped back from his wife's world long before the formal separation. We reached him through a contact of Celestine's who lived in Savannah. A message delivered by hand, not by phone, not by email. The message said only, "We have information about the foundation. We need to meet. It concerns your safety and your daughter's." He responded within 6 hours. He would come to a diner off the interstate in Macon, Saturday at noon, alone. We left before light Saturday morning. Celestine drove. I sat in back with Jerome. Lynette was with us despite our protests, and she had been quietly immovable about it. He is my father. I should be the one to tell him. There is a particular silence that settles over people when they are moving towards something they cannot undo. We drove through 2 hours of it. Winston Holt was already seated when we walked in. He was thinner than his photographs and had the careful stillness of a man who had been braced for bad news for a long time and had made a kind of peace with its arrival. He stood when he saw Lynette. He looked at her the way fathers look at daughters they have not adequately protected, with a full accounting of every failure written plainly on his face. He shook Jerome's hand without hesitation. He met my eyes and nodded once. Celestine laid her documents on the table. Winston looked at them for a moment without touching them. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a manila envelope beside her folder. "My attorney has been gathering material for 14 months, he said. "I didn't have the offshore structures, but I had enough to know the foundation was being used as a vehicle for something. I was trying to find a way to move forward without destroying Lynette in the process." He looked at his daughter. "I want you to know I was never going to let it go on." Your way of not letting it go on almost got my son killed, I said. I said it quietly, because my father raised me to say hard things without raising my voice. Winston Holt did not argue with me. What he had in his envelope was something neither Celestine nor Jerome had found. Correspondence, letters from Eugenia to a lawyer in Augusta, written 2 years prior, exploring the possibility of having Jerome's architectural credentials reviewed on the basis of fabricated questions about his documentation. She had been working to dismantle my son's career from a distance quietly, because his success made it harder for Lynette to leave him. 2 years of letters. 2 years of a woman trying to pull the ground out from under someone who had never done anything to her except exist in a family she had decided he didn't belong in. I read those letters in a diner booth in Macon, and I thought about my father walking his mail route with his head up for 31 years. I thought about what those letters would have done to my son if they had worked. And I understood in that moment that there was no version of this that ended in a small reckoning. Winston and Celestine discussed what came next. The federal reporting, the coordination required, the protection Lynette and Jerome would need during the process. I watched Lynette listen to the plan her father had been carrying, alone, and I watched her understand, the way adult children understand the failures and fears of their parents, what his silence had cost, and what it had been trying to prevent. After Winston left, Celestine told us the last thing she had found. She had saved it, I believe, because she wanted the rest of that meeting to proceed without it. 2 years ago, Lynette had lost a pregnancy at 14 weeks. The doctors had called it unexplained, attributed it to hormonal deficiency and stress. Lynette had carried the blame for it, with the particular cruelty that women apply to these losses, convinced she had done something wrong or failed to do something right. Celestine had found pharmacy records. A customer account opened under a different name at a drugstore 2 counties over, picking up a specific medication, one used to suppress progesterone levels, over a period of 11 weeks. The billing address traced back to an LLC that Eugenia Holt controlled. The timing of the pickups matched the timeline of Lynette's pregnancy exactly, week by week. Jerome set his good hand flat on the table and did not speak. Lynette made a sound I have never heard from another person and hope never to hear again. I did not cry. I have learned in 63 years that some things are too large for tears in the moment. They find you later, when the work is done. What I felt sitting in that booth was the thing my father used to describe when he talked about certain injustices. A slow burning clarity, like a lamp being turned to its highest setting. Eugenia Holt had decided that my son's child should never be born. She had acted on that decision. Because of what blood that child would carry into the world. The federal investigation was opened within 3 weeks. Winston cooperated fully and without reservation. Celestine had assembled documentation that a contact at the FBI's Atlanta field office described, according to Celestine, as unusually organized. The Foundation's accounts were frozen. The shell companies began to unravel one after another. Jerome's architectural credentials were, needless to say, completely intact and had never been in any real jeopardy. Eugenia was arrested on a Tuesday morning in February. Wire fraud, money laundering, and after the pharmacy records were examined, and a former housekeeper, Celestine, located in Valdosta, agreed to give a statement, criminal interference with a pregnancy. Her attorney advised her to cooperate in exchange for a plea arrangement. She did. She will not be returning to Whitfield County. Lynette and Jerome stayed with me through the winter. When the house felt too small, they stayed with Winston in Savannah, which none of us would have predicted the previous September. Winston turned out to be a different person than the distant figure from 4 family dinners over 6 years. He called Jerome by his name the way people do when they mean it. He asked me one evening about my father, what he was like, what he had done for work. I told him about the mail route and the piano and the Sunday school. He listened in the way that certain people listen, which is to say, you could tell it was going somewhere inside him that it would stay. In March, Jerome and Lynette moved into a house in a neighborhood where the elementary school was rated excellent, the door closed, and the streets had mature trees, and where Jerome had designed 3 of the adjacent homes himself over the previous 4 years. Lynette planted tomatoes in the backyard in April. She called me every morning that spring to report on how they were doing, which is a kind of happiness I hadn't known. I'd been waiting to hear in her voice. On a warm morning in early June, I was on my porch with coffee when Jerome called. He said 2 sentences, and I heard Lynette in the background and I understood. I drove to the hospital with Celestine, who had come down from Atlanta for the weekend as if she'd known. We sat in the waiting room with Winston across from us, and for 7 hours we existed in that particular suspension that maternity wards produce, where everything outside the building recedes. And the only thing that matters is the small, enormous thing happening somewhere down the hall. The nurse opened the door at 11:48 in the morning. A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, loud and healthy, and already, the nurse said, showing what she described as definite opinions about her situation. Jerome was still in the room when I walked in. Lynette was holding the baby with the exhausted certainty of a woman who has just done something her body didn't know it had in it. Jerome looked at me over his wife's head, and his eyes were full in a way I will not try to describe. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at this child. She had Jerome's wide forehead and Lynette's small nose, and something in the set of her jaw that I recognized immediately as my father's, transplanted through 40 years and 2 generations into this small, new, very certain face. "What are you naming her?" I asked. Jerome looked at Lynette. Lynette looked at me. "Leona," she said, "for your mother." I did not cry in the diner in Macon. I did not cry through the investigation or the arrest or the long gray winter of waiting. I cried then, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in Macon, Georgia, holding my granddaughter, named for a woman who played piano until her fingers gave out and taught Sunday school until she couldn't stand long enough to do it anymore. Leona Lattimore Wills. Celestine came in a few minutes later. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the baby for a long time, and I watched her face do something it rarely does, which is simply to open. "There she is," Celestine said quietly. "There she is. The daughter of a man who was left in a creek in November for the blood he carried. Carrying that blood forward in a body that already, on the first day of her life, had something to say about it. People talk about blood like it is a fixed thing, a category, a limit, a verdict. Eugenia Holt built her entire life on a set of beliefs about what certain blood permitted and what it disqualified, and she was willing to do whatever was necessary to enforce those beliefs. She thought that was strength. She thought that was protecting something worth protecting. She was wrong about every part of it. What I know about blood is what my father showed me on that mail route, and what my mother put into music every Sunday, and what Celestine confirmed 11 years ago when she started calling me every Sunday at 6 o'clock and has not missed a week. Blood is not a category, it is a practice. It is the daily work of people who refuse to let the ones they love face the worst things alone. That is all it has ever been. And on the day my granddaughter was born, in a county that has not always known what to do with people who look like us, that practice put something into the world that nothing Eugenia Holt ever tried was going to stop. Leona opened her eyes while I was holding her, dark and clear and steady, taking inventory of everything around her with the blameless seriousness of someone who has just arrived and intends to stay. I held her a little closer. "You come from a long line of people who don't quit," I told her. "I'll introduce you to them one by one." She had nothing to say to that, but she held on.